Great. So as I said, welcome today. My name is Michele Regan. This is Inspired Instruction's monthly webinar. Each month, we like to present a topic that we feel is timely and relevant to the education space. And so I'm so glad you could join us today. The recording will be available, it'll be posted on our website. So if there's anybody today that you know that could not make it, feel free to send them to our website. Okay. And I'm going to continue to let a few more people in. And I'm just going to check out. Okay, so someone said that there is a black bar. So that's my video. So I'm going to move it and I'm going to ask, do I now have the black bar across the bottom? Yes. Okay. Okay. So then what that means is if I close that out, I won't be able to see your faces. So I will do that. But every once in a while, I will open it back up so I can see you. So I can kind of see how everyone is going, everyone is doing, and get some feedback. Is that better?
Yes, that's better now.
Excellent. Okay. So feel free to unmute as we work through this presentation today. I'd love it to be interactive. I'd love it to apply to the specific issues that you're having around data and what to do with that data in your school or in your district. Okay, so again, just going to check. So it looks like it's better. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome. As you know, this time of year is the time that we start getting in our standardized assessment data. And so today you'll hear me talk about the different types of data. And we're not going to talk specifically about, say, for example, in New Jersey, our state assessment is called the NJSLA. We're not going to speak specifically to one state's or one type of data. Instead, we're going to think about it overall in terms of how can we make it meaningful. Okay, so we're going to talk about the different types of data, how we make meaning from that data. Now what? So now that we have it, what do we do with it? And specifically, how do we use it to plan instruction and differentiate instruction? And then finally, I wanted to highlight a particular strategy, and that is small group instruction. So we're going to share some best practices for how to use data to effectively create small groups. Okay. So again, please feel free to unmute, put in the chat your thoughts, your questions, and there will be time at the end for Q&A. Okay, so when we talk about data, what do I mean? What are we really looking at? So we're going to take a look at a couple of examples, and I'm just going to ask you kind of what jumps out at you, and I'm going to share with you kind of my takeaways from looking at that particular form or piece of data. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm going to use New Jersey as an example. This is our state assessment data. This is a grade 5 classroom at one particular school. And just looking at the data, are there things that you maybe have questions about? Are there things that jump out at you as things that I want to make sure that I consider? Sorry about that. I want to try to move that little black bar.
So to interrupt, are we going to have access to this PowerPoint at the end?
So I will share with you any of the handouts that come from today. We typically don't share the PowerPoint, but what I can also do is a PDF version. That's the slides with the little note-taking section. I can share that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any thoughts jump out at you? Or you can drop it in chat. You can unmute. Is there something that, you know, from looking at this starts you thinking and starts some questions coming to mind? Anybody at all? Okay. So as you're working through, as we work through this, please don't hesitate to join and to just unmute or put something in chat. But when I look at this data, what immediately jumps out at me using the key is the way that the district, if we look up in the top right-hand corner, this gives me information about our state, it gives me information about the district, and it gives me information about the school. And that's important for me as an administrator, as an instructional coach, or even as a teacher, to be able to see, well, where does my district fall? Where does my school fall? And then in this particular case, where does my class, this grade 5 class, fall? Okay, so things like looking at, are we following the trend line, the progression? Is there a large gap between my district and my school? So in some cases, we say they are exactly on the line together, right? We see on question 23 and 24 that both the district and the school performed exactly the same. And then in other places, we could look at other questions where we see a gap between district performance and school performance. So some of these things just start questions forming in my mind when I'm looking at this data. Okay, so Ms. Taylor said, what happened with questions 7, 13, and 17 when the school did much lower than the district and the state? So Ms. Taylor, that's exactly what I'm looking for. I want us to think about, you know, what are questions that we have, because with any of our data, we always want to remember that it is a snapshot in time. And so there's going to be meaning we can make, and there's other things that we want to consider that might be less meaningful. Okay, so one of the things I want to share with you about this data, and if you are from another state, this is likely true in your state reporting as well, is you'll see question 1 and question 5, they are flat. It looks to me like nobody got a correct answer. Well, here's what's important to know. If we go on to the second page of this data, it's this nice little chart that accompanies the graph. And it shows me, if I look all the way to the right, the school student count, how many people actually received, or how many students actually received that question. And you can see, I just mentioned to you question 1 and question 5. Well, guess what? Nobody got that question. And that's really important to know, because we don't want to take a first glance at a piece of data and think, oh my gosh, look, these are difficult questions. These are very specific standards, and my students can't answer them. Okay, so I guess my first point here is to know what you're looking at. When you receive in data reporting, either from the state or some other source, if you outsource to the various companies that do formative assessment or online assessment, is you want to make sure you know what you're looking at. Okay, any thoughts or questions just about that little piece, is being really clear about knowing what we're looking at? Has anyone had an experience where you may have misinterpreted something because at first glance something seemed like, okay, I get what this is telling me, and then you found out later like, oh, maybe not so much, or maybe it was confusing from the start? Anybody have that experience?
But what can I have a question right here?
Yes, so have you ever had an experience like that where you looked at data kind of at first glance and interpreted it one way, and then found out after the fact that maybe I didn't have all the information and I was misinterpreting the data?
Definitely, I recall that, from a couple of years ago. So I'm glad you pointed out in here, like number 1, number 5, because my question to that was like, why we have this in there if I'm pretty sure that was 2 questions in the test, right?
Right.
And why they put it in the results if no one received, like, those 2 questions?
Okay, great question. That's a really good question. So what this may be true, and I think in probably on most standardized testing, there are different, it's a pool or a bank of questions, and there may be different forms that students receive. So on any given testing day, they have this bank of 24 questions, and students are going to receive some variation of them. So that's a great question. And I'm really thankful that you stepped up and said, yes, that happened to me. When I first looked at data, I wasn't exactly sure what I was seeing, or I was misinterpreting. Okay, definitely something to keep in mind. And so I always love to do this work in a group setting, because often another set of eyes or a couple of sets of eyes can be really helpful in terms of, is this what I think I'm seeing? And then the other tip there is to make sure you read all the accompanying documents, because a lot of people will receive this document, and because it is so visually appealing and seems like it's pretty clear to understand, they skip over this piece. And yet this is really important because it shows me, hey, where do I want to spend my time? I want to make sure that I'm analyzing and spending time on the questions that most students got. So you can see on this right-hand column, I want to spend time looking at the ones that 51 students got that question. Okay, makes sense? There's also some other things to consider. And let me just check out our question. Ms. Van Zant, you shared, I've noticed sometimes it's difficult to understand what the number means. That's a great point. That's a really good point, because sometimes they're throwing in numbers that mean the actual number. So in this case, on this slide, student count is the actual number of students. So 37 students in this school in this 5th grade. Okay, but to your point, there's other documentation, and I don't know if I have a picture of it in this presentation. Let me jump ahead. In other cases, it's a percentage. Okay, so in this case, it actually shows you the percentage, but there is another reporting form in New Jersey, and I'm sure that this is true at other places as well, that includes a number, but you actually have to read the heading, and the heading says percent of students who, right? So great point is be clear about what exactly the numbers are representing. Okay. All right. So in this case, again, I just wanted to show you that when I'm looking at this, what do I do to make meaning? And the first thing that I do is I look at the standards that were tested. So whether you are receiving reporting data from your state, reporting data from common assessments that your district might give, again, outsourcing with outside companies, you want to look at, what does it boil down to? I don't want to just know that kids are having trouble with reading literature. I need to know specifically what standards they are struggling with. Because if I look at these first 5 questions in reading literature, I can see that the second question, 38% of my students got it correct. The 4th question, 41% got it correct. Okay, not so bad. But this next 5th question, only 5% of students, or 2 students, got it correct. So that's very telling. Okay, and so I want to look into first, what is the standard? There's also more that I want to know. And one of the things I want to know is, how was the question presented? Okay, so I'm going to open this up to everybody here. When you receive back any kind of reporting data, do you have a process by which you try to find out how is the question asked? Is that a procedure you're engaged in? I'd love to hear from anybody who wants to share. Okay, so I'm going to answer that for you. Okay,
I'll
so
jump in,
you want to,
Michelle.
go ahead.
I think what you're saying is absolutely important, because on the New Jersey State test, looking at the type of question, sometimes those multiple selects are very, very difficult for the students. They may get 1 correct, 2 correct, but the fact that they don't get all of them correct, or, you know,
So true.
they don't get everything they're supposed to get correct, indicates they may not, the data shows that they don't know it, but they may just miss 1 answer, which is just a small part of that question. So it is important to go look back at the questions.
Gloria, I am so glad you said that, because that segues into the next piece that I was going to share about this particular piece. But in many of the, in the standardized tests, they offer students partial credit, which is awesome, but that can be misleading in terms of the data. So let's look at this sheet again. Okay, what Gloria said is, I want to know, if I look in the column that says incorrect, I certainly want to know what percentage of students got them incorrect and what standard that is. But if I look over at the partial, That is very telling because it tells me something is going on and it may not be related to the standard. Instead, it might be related, like Gloria said, to the way the question is asked. And were students asked as is the trend right now or is the practice right now, were they asked to provide more than one answer? So for example, in ELA, that typically is something like provide 2 pieces of good evidence or the best evidence. Okay, in math, as Gloria pointed out, it could be a part 1 or a part 2, right? So there are opportunities for students to demonstrate some understanding, but we're not exactly sure what this partial is telling us. So Jen Brandon, I thank you for sharing. She wrote that they try to break down the questions. So a critical piece, my point in showing you these various reporting forms, is a critical piece of data analysis is knowing exactly what students were asked. Okay, so whatever that test is, and I'll give you an example. There's one particular company that's very popular. It's a testing that many people I am aware that use nationally, I believe, and they don't show you the question. So to me, that's, it just is giving me less information, because while it's telling me students might be performing poorly in a particular standard, I, as the teacher or as the coach or as the principal, have no idea how the question was asked. So it's just something to keep in mind. And you have a little bit more control over that when you're using school created assessments. Okay, so when I talk about, any data you receive back, we want to make sure we know what exactly it is it's telling us. And that is why it leads into this next slide. I absolutely love this. These numbers have a story to tell, but it's going to take some knowledgeable people spending time with it to give it a voice. Okay, and one of the questions I typically ask when we talk about data, and I am going to open up the block so I can see your faces, is I usually ask people, how do you feel about data? So is your immediate reaction like, hey, I'm a data nerd, I love to spend time with this, or, I'm in data denial. If it's due on the last day of the month, I don't look at it till the night before. But I'm assuming, since you're here today, that you have an understanding of how important data is. So I'm not even going to ask you the question. Let's see, somebody threw something into chat. Okay, Jen says, I'm in the middle. So maybe most of you here are somewhere in the middle, and that's a good thing. But really, I think our goal, and one of the takeaways that I think will be coming from today, is the importance of giving it a voice. And so that's why I always like to share that idea of having a group of people look at the data and hear people's perceptions or perspectives about what the data is telling us. Okay, so how do we give it a voice? There's 3 really important steps. And the first is to organize the data. So today, if you are interested in any of the documents that I'm showing you, we will be following up after today. And we're actually going to also share with you an evaluation. Please just add to the evaluation, yes, I would like the resources shared. Okay, so this is a document that we created. Okay, and I'm going to actually show you the whole thing if I can pop out of it for a second. And this can be edited for your own state tests. And can someone let me know, can you see my screen? Just give me a thumbs up if you can see. Okay, excellent. Thank you. So we like to do it by grade, because the idea is that you want to be able to find trends so that when you are making critical instructional decisions, you can be thinking about, what do my 5th graders need? What are my 5th graders lacking, right? A whole grade, as opposed to one particular class. Now, there is a purpose for doing that as well, but for this purpose, we're going to talk about a whole grade level. And so the document is a Google Doc that can be edited by you for your school. And, we're using CCSS, which is the Common Core State Standards, sub in whatever standards, whatever your state calls them. Okay. But what we do is in the data analysis, we look at the top 3 items that show our strengths and the bottom 3 items that show our needs. And so we identify the specific domain, So is this a reading literature, a reading informational text? In math, is this a operations, number? I'm not the math lady, but you would put the domain down here. So Gloria, feel free to speak up. You would put the standard, and then you would put a sample question. Okay. Because again, this is where you can have that nice conversation about, what? Listen, we did poorly, but so did our district and so did the state. And I'm really wondering if that might mean that it's the way the question was asked. Perhaps the students have never seen this type of question before. Okay. And then once we organize the data, we're going to go ahead on to step 2. Any questions about using this type of data analysis form? Okay. Notice I'm not looking at every question. So on the ELA sheet that I just showed you, there were 24 questions. So I am not spending time right now analyzing all 25 questions. I really want to know, where are those strengths? Because how can I leverage them? I might be able to leverage them to help me with the others. And then I really want to know those bottom questions, those questions that kids really struggled with. Okay. All right. So I've organized my data. Now what? Now I need to analyze it. And we do that by having some guiding questions. So at the start, I asked you, did you have any questions that came to mind when you saw the data? Here are 4 that I like to be my guiding questions. And I heard from Bree, I love data analysis. Most of my fellow staff members come to me to help with the spreadsheets. So Bree, that's really important because there is usually 1 or 2 people in a building that love doing this. So if you can make yourself accessible, kind of put the word out that you're there to support, I think that's awesome. But again, I would even go further to talk to somebody in the administration to say, hey, let's do some group work around this so that people don't feel like they're on an island if this is not their wheelhouse. And Gina shared, it can be overwhelming. And so that's exactly what I'm speaking to. Okay, so we have some real questions here that we can be thinking about as we're analyzing that data. So imagine I have the data in front of me. I want to identify those trends. What did I notice? Were they specific standards? And were these standards that maybe I know were not introduced until the end of April, beginning of May, right around when testing started, and maybe we didn't cover it all, right? So we want to start thinking about the trends and what those things might mean. We also want to think about the curriculum. So like I just said, where in the curriculum do some of these standards come up? Or if these are standards that might be more challenging, do we need to hit them multiple times? Or are there just gaps? Are there gaps in the curriculum that standards are not being addressed or not being addressed to the fullest? Okay. Are there prerequisite skills? So something that comes to mind for me is that last year in New Jersey, it was the first time that students tested in several years. So there were students that are coming from being in getting home instruction, basically virtual or remote instruction for 1.5 to 2 years. And now they're being asked to perform on a test. So there's a good chance that there are some prerequisite skills that may have need to be beefed up or readdressed. Okay, so something to keep in mind. And then lastly, what about instructional considerations? What do we know about best practices that could help us be successful or help us help our students to be successful on these state tests? So for example, one of the things that I talk about often is unpacking any of the assessments that we use on a regular basis. So do you have a unit assessment? Do you have, benchmark assessments? This is not to say we're teaching to the test. What we are doing is we're looking in the curriculum, we're looking at the assessment, we're backwards planning, and we're making sure that whatever skills or concepts students need to be successful, that we have little milestones throughout the course of that month or those 3 weeks or those 6 weeks, where we can say that, yes, we have hit those and we have checked for understanding along the way. Okay, so that's one specific practice that I think is important to engage in. Okay. So other thoughts about using these questions? Are there other questions that you use that help guide you when you're analyzing data? Okay, because we're short on time, I'm going to go ahead and share a couple thoughts with you about this and about the things coming up. So Ms. Taylor, you said trends. Okay, super important that that's a guiding factor. And what just popped in my mind as you were typing that in was we can look at specific subgroups or groups of students. So are we looking at our students that receive special education services or English language learners, right? Or other subgroups of students? That can be very informative as well. And I don't dissuade people from doing that, but I typically have them look at the overall first, and then you can dive into your subgroups. Okay, Gina, oh, perfect. So are we pacing appropriately? So especially in math, I think that's a really important piece, is think about when did this data, when were these tests taken, and what does that tell me about my pacing? Okay. And I have to apologize for the little dinging sounds. That's a notification I get that I cannot shut off right this minute. So I apologize if you're hearing that in the background. Okay, so I want to talk about, we've analyzed the data. Now what are we doing with it? So the next step should be to inform any instruction that we do in grouping. And we know that best practices is to not do whole group instruction all the time. There should be small group instruction happening. And especially in the case where students are struggling, we need to be using small group for intervention purposes and differentiation for all of our students, no matter where they fall. So I wanted to share the way that it is recommended to create your groups using data. So let me share what these numbers mean. So these are the numbers that I have ranked my students based on a set of scores. So imagine they just took a math benchmark and you lined up your 21 students and you put them in the order that the highest score is number 1 and my lowest score is number 21. So what I do is I have a list of 1 to 21 of those scores, and then I sort them into 3 groups. So I have 1 to 7, and then I have 8 to 14, and then I have 15 to 21. And I use that to create mixed ability groups. Okay, this affords me the opportunity to have my lowest student with a student that performed fairly well. Okay, one of the top 7 students. And then I have my middle student. So this is the way that it's recommended to create your mixed ability groups so that there is a high, middle, and low student in every group. Okay. If you're looking to create groups by performance on a particular benchmark so that you can provide support based on where they fell and you want to work with a group, then you may consider doing ability grouping. And when you do ability grouping, you're going to put them in order of, highest to lowest, but you're going to sort them by your top scorers are going to be in a group together. Right? That next set of high scorers is going to be in a group together. Now I'm showing you 5 groups. You might only have 3 groups. You might have 4 groups. The number of groups doesn't matter. This is just showing you, I'm wanting to create this particular type of group because I want to, as the teacher, provide intervention. So I may work with E. I may work with E and D on a given day, while A, B, and C can work independently. Okay, so just some thought about ways to create flexible grouping. Now, notice I'm saying flexible grouping. Students should be moving in and out of groups based on performance on a number of assessments. These should not be created and then stagnant. Okay, so that's why I show both, because I like to use both for different purposes, right? If there's students that are strong, have a strong comprehension of something, say for example, but maybe are having difficulty reading complex text, I would use mixed ability grouping, because I would want that student to have access to those high level discussions and use of vocabulary, even if they can't read the text. So different purposes for each, and students, it should be very clear to students that they are going to be moving in and out of these types of groups. Okay. I want to get rid of my little black bar for you guys. Sorry about that. Any thoughts or questions about how we create groups from the data? Okay, so I had the question the other day when I did a workshop with a group of administrators. I had a question about, should we be creating groups based on NJSLA data or high stakes assessment data, right? State testing that happened, last May. And my question always is, it's definitely good information to start the year out with. And if you have students that have performed noticeably low that you feel, hey, this group I can target for intervention right now, then my answer is yes. But typically, I like to use much more recent data to create my groups. And it's a way for us to also think about how often are students being assessed and in what ways, because we want to make sure that those assessments are actually giving us meaningful information and that information is being used. Okay. All right, in the chat, what if students perform inconsistently? Okay, that's a great question. And you mentioned that you have trouble with students not taking them seriously. So I think that's very typical on the high stakes assessment. And so there are definitely strategies that you can engage students in to try to improve their performance. And what I mean by that is their willingness to attempt and try on those high stakes assessments. I'm going to almost defer that and say that's a conversation for another day. And we do have workshops and strategies that we use for that. And that's probably why I defer to that data that's happening more frequently. So if you have high stakes assessment data and a student performs very poorly, but then in the regular, consistent end of unit work, and even on the formative assessments, they're demonstrating proficiency, I'm going to go with that more frequent and recent data. Okay, does that make sense? Because really what I'm looking for is, I've taught the standard, a week has gone by, can they now apply that and recall it? I've taught the unit, can they apply it, right? Is much more important. And again, not that state assessment data is not important, but we have some very specific strategies that we can do to try to engage students in approaching those tests and taking them seriously. Okay, just trying to keep an eye on time here. All right, so now what do? We've organized, we've analyzed, we found those trends, we started making some ability grouping or mixed ability grouping. This is just an example. And I love visuals, so I wanted to throw this in, of how I'm working with differentiated small groups. Okay, I'm working, and I call that a guided group, with a small group of students that may need intervention or may need more support, or maybe they're English language learners and I just want to do some, modeling. And then I have my 3 other groups that the work is differentiated. So group 2, group 3, and group 4, each of them might have work that looks a little bit different. Okay, and we're going to look at what are some best practices around that. The objective, the student learning objective or the standard is the same, but what might be differentiated are things like the level of structure or the amount of scaffolding or access to other resources, right? So some things like that. But what I also love about this picture is it shows that the teacher is intentionally moving throughout the classroom at various points of time. Okay, so yes, this is a 40-minute period. I've done a 7-minute mini lesson at the start to walk through what task is to be expected. And then I work for 20, 22 minutes And then I spend the rest of the time moving around the groups. And we do this for a couple of reasons. Okay. And these are my kind of strategies for making sure that my small group work is intentional and is effective. Okay. But I just want to jump over to this last piece where it says ongoing assessment, because this bullet is really important. The teacher is moving through the room and monitoring groups and students' work. That's going to be a critical piece to success. And I'm going to share on the next slide how that will inform what happens next. Okay. So when I talked about the teacher moving through the room, that's what I mean. But let's just run through these specific strategies that I want to consider for each phase. Okay. So intentional planning, we're thinking about what work is going to be given based on their ability level, even though the student learning objective is the same. And we also want to make sure that those activities are engaging every student cognitively, and that there are specific accountability measures, I'm sorry about that, in place. So every student is writing something. Every student is recording something. Every student might have a whiteboard. It could look different. Doesn't have to look the same all the time, but every student is engaged. Okay. Those increase your likelihood that students are going to stay on task. Okay. In terms of rigorous implementation, I mentioned that short mini lesson at the start. The teacher is going to provide explicit instruction and group expectations. Okay. And if this is done frequently enough, that means that the routine has been practiced. If this only happens once a month, you're going to be less likely that they're going to be effective. Okay. And let's jump into this ongoing assessment, because this is the piece that I think speaks to using data effectively. Okay. And again, I'm not trying to stop questions. Please feel free. Oh, I forgot I wanted to share this. One of our content creators created this, and I think it's a nice little planning sheet. When we were talking about intentional planning, we want to be really specific, and let's be honest, we want to make it easy for ourselves. So we might have one student learning objective that we can identify the standard and the concept, but we want to plan our activities out for the week. If this is writing, maybe they're engaging in brainstorming or pre-write, and then they go on to some individualized time, but at the end of the class, they're going to meet with their group for peer assessment, right? So we really want to spell it out here. Okay. That ongoing assessment, I identified 3 specific ways to assess, and student work is the first. So I want to give you some examples of some student work that is going to allow the teacher to give immediate feedback, but it's also going to help the teacher plan for the next session. Okay. I'm going to show you 3 slides. Each of these slides have a particular student's work. So what happened in this situation was the teacher literally uses her cell phone to take snapshots of student work. Okay, you certainly don't have to do that, but you can just take the student work at the end. You know, you can make a little note, you can put a little star as you're walking around the room from group to group. And then at the end of the day, when you collect the work, you can pull the ones that you starred, because this is what you're going to use to inform what happens next. So in real time, this teacher was able to engage the student in a question. The teacher asked the student to explain her work to her classmates. Now, interestingly, the student thought immediately that she was wrong, right? But so we want to engage students in the practice of being able to explain their thinking. That's really, really important. But this is helpful if you have a document camera, or if you have, if you just took that snapshot on your phone, or if there is a way to use your smartboard or projector to show student work, because it's a way for students to see an exemplar. You do not have to do it with the student's name on it. If you decide at the end of my lesson, for today's lesson for closure, I'm going to show an exemplar piece and I'm going to have students talk about it, they don't have to know whose work this was. Okay. Student B, similarly, as the teacher was walking around and saw this work, they could identify what was happening, either a misconception, in this case, identified that the student perhaps didn't have an understanding of that foundational knowledge of proportions. Okay. They may also use it as a bit of closure at the end of the lesson, just to be able to point out to students, to the rest of the class, hey, guys, what would be precision here, right? We want to have students use precise language, use precision in math, and to have them identify that the access labels are missing. Okay. And finally, this student, the teacher, as they're walking around, can immediately identify that this student isn't following the instructions, right? There's no work shown. So they can give immediate feedback to that student. And again, identify. So now tomorrow, when we're doing small group work, maybe this student needs to move into my group. Okay. So the use of student work is extremely powerful. And it can be done in all content areas. Okay, we don't have time for me to share this video with you today, but just to let you know what's happening here, I think it's a great strategy. This teacher uses a document camera. And what she does is she has each group identified on the left-hand side. So it'll say group A, group B, group C, group D with the member name. And then what she does is, as she's walking around listening in, she comes back up to the document camera and makes a statement about what's happening in the group. So for example, things it might say is, students are engaging in accountable talk using I agree with you, I disagree with you stems, right? Students are using academic vocabulary. So this is done as a way to support classroom management and management of the groups. It's also a way to give immediate feedback to groups like, hey, we're not doing X, I need to do Y to get points. Now, what I love that she does is she gives what she calls participation points, right? So it's another active classroom management strategy, but students also know what the success criteria is for the activity. So they're attempting to reach those, to meet that on that rubric, whether that be listening, speaking and listening standards, or whatever standards you're working on that day. Okay. And the last routine I want to talk about today before we get ready to wrap things up, because I know I'm winding down. You'll hear this called a couple of different things. So I've heard the term aggressive monitoring. So aggressive monitoring is really a routine that you engage in, and it can be very much like what I just described in the other two descriptions, the other two strategies, where you're giving targeted feedback to every student. Okay. And you can use, there's various types of forms that you can use, but what is nice about this one, and I'm actually going to share with you what it looks like. If you can let me know if you can see my screen. Can you see my screen with the blue form? Ms. Taylor, thank you. Okay, so at the top, I have my student learning objective, and I've identified in advance the criteria for success. How will I know the students are successful? That should also be shared with them. They should know that, okay? But then also some possible misconceptions. And then I'm going to use this as I walk around my groups, and I have a little key here, and I also have space for notes. So in this group, I might have the student's name. So it might say Nick and Bree and Jen, and I'm going to put a number, this student 1 needs reteach, and then I can give very specific thoughts, just like was done on that piece with the student work, right? What that teacher did that after the fact, you could do that using a form like this, whether you actually collect the student work or not, right? So this is a Google Doc. You can adjust this how you like. Some people call it progress monitoring or tracking. So it's called a couple of different things, but this is what's going to allow you to then take this back to that original set of data that you had and compare and see how it's changing. So if in the beginning, my students were really struggling with standard, let's say RI 5.5, right? It's a structure standard, about text structure. But now I can directly connect that these 3 lessons that I did over the past week are directly connected to that. And I have seen growth, or I have seen students that need intervention, and I've been able to make those instructional decisions. Okay. So hopefully today I was able to provide you with some tips about making data meaningful and some resources. So like I said, I'm going to share with you in a moment in the chat. I'm going to share with you the survey, the evaluation for today. And if you're interested in receiving any of these documents, I'm happy to send them to you, and we can do a follow-up. We always like to hear, if we share our resources, we always like to hear how you found them. Were they working? So let me go ahead and share this survey with everyone. Okay, so we ask that you fill that out if you would. But before we end today, I'd love to hear if people have questions, if things came to mind as I was talking, maybe something that didn't come up today that you have questions about.
Michelle, the Google Drive you just shared asks us to request access.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to go in and take a look at that really quickly. I apologize. I don't know why that, we usually have the settings set to default. Let me stop sharing my screen. And they usually default to allowing everybody access. So let me quickly find that. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And see if I can change that really quickly. Today is what date? Today is the 26th. 10/26. Evaluation. While I'm finding this, here it is. While I'm finding this and allowing access, does anybody have other questions? I do not see it allowing me. Oh, here it is, settings. Okay, different place. Default. I don't see it saying it has to be inspired instruction. Restrict users. It's not on. I'm going to try it again, and I'm going to give you a different link, and we'll see if that works. And if it doesn't work, what I'll do, because I don't want to hold people, is I will end up emailing everybody, but hopefully this one will work. Let's see. Chat. Can anyone let me know if that one works? Excellent.
Yes,
Thank
I
you,
could get that
Catherine.
one.
I really appreciate it. I probably actually gave you guys the wrong link. I probably pulled a link from one of my documents that I was going to share with you guys. So
That was
while
the first one was a Google Drive, and this one is the
oh,
Google
thank
form.
you. Sorry about
Yeah.
that. I must have grabbed the wrong link. While we are having people fill that out, does anyone have questions or thoughts that come to mind? Well, I really appreciate everybody coming out this afternoon. Like I said, feel free to jot down if you're interested in the resources, and then this recording will be posted. So I know some of you had some colleagues that weren't able to make it today. And I did just see a question. How can you use paper-based test data for kindergartners? The results aren't always reliable and can be indicative of the unfamiliarity with test taking. That's a very good point. So again, with anything for kindergartners that is more of a standardized test, I think that's going to give you some data, but it's not going to give you the whole picture. I think looking at student work is so much more useful in the early, very early grades like preschool and kindergarten. I was an early childhood person for a while, and looking at actual student pieces, or even students, you know, in preschool, in some of the curriculums, they actually have you take pictures of what the student is doing. So it could be a student working with manipulatives. It could be a student persisting at a task. It could be a student using various strategies. So that's much more reliable and can show the progress and the kind of information you're looking for. That doesn't mean we're going to throw out the standardized testing for young people, for kindergartners. But I think we just have to keep in mind that that data might be more indicative of a student being unfamiliar with how to test. So the only thing I can say to that is by providing students access to the testing platform or the testing experience, right? So let's say this test is timed, having students just have an experience with working on something for a particular amount of time. Or if they are going to have to work on the computer, we don't want the first time they go onto that platform to be test day. We want them to have experience, and even if it's just scrolling around, right? So that's something that we always give as a tip is let them get into the system and just scroll around and just kind of play with it. So it's not so unfamiliar on the first day that they do that. Okay. Good question. Any other thoughts or questions? I want to make sure I answered. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, I thank everyone so much for coming out today. Again, send me over that evaluation survey and I will respond with the resources. And if there's anything that you want to go more in depth, obviously today was a short period of time. It was like 40-45 minutes. We do these workshops. We come to schools, we present them for admin teams, we present them district-wide, we present them to teachers. This one was a specific topic around digging into data, but we have, for example, the small group strategies that I shared with you today. We have a full 2.5-hour workshop on that, where teachers would actually get to walk away with strategies that they could apply the next day. So any of your PD needs, please don't hesitate to reach out. And again, thanks everyone. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.